Fabulous, thank you. So welcome to our second to last webinar in this series of the 10 knowledge areas. We're going to be taking a look at procurement here. And when we look at procurement, the advice that I always have for people is call the procurement department, or AKA call an expert. So we've got a special guest that we'll be introducing in a few minutes. So I'm really happy about that, and yeah, let's get started. So as always, there's myself, David, as your host, and supporting us here is Jessica. She'll be handling the sound issues, technical issues, etc. So if you do have any issues, please feel free to pop into the chat box, type that in. Jessica will be monitoring that and helping us out. As always, our webinars are recorded, so if you need to watch the recording later, that is an option. At the top, we have a little option for you to raise your hands. There's a number of options there, so if we're going too fast, too slow, too quiet, that kind of thing, just feel free to pop in there. As I mentioned, the chat box is down the bottom, actually, sorry, after the right there, and feel free to pop in at any time if you have an idea or a thought or a question or even a comment. Please pop in there, and as always, we'll be doing a very interactive session today with polls and questions. And of course, we always accept applause. Okay. So our opening thought today. Now, I always like to open my sessions with this opening thought, and Chef Mario Batali. I don't know if any of you watch Iron Chef Canada or Iron Chef America. He was the greatest. I mean, he has the highest winning record, and just an absolute phenomenal person. So I was kind of thinking about procurement, and procurement in a lot of ways is all about getting us the raw materials for us to make that great meal. And so with a bit of a food theme today, I wanted to open some food for thought here. Spend for the best stuff available. Logic dictates that you can make delicious food only with delicious ingredients. And when we think about that in terms of a project, if I don't have good quality inputs, I don't have good quality outputs. And this is the classic scenario of garbage in, garbage out, whether I'm running a report, whether I'm analyzing data, whether I'm building a building, whatever that looks like. If we don't have good quality data, or good quality inputs, we're gonna have not so good results. And as I'm saying this, it comes to mind as the one of the great fails in our history, in our human history, the Titanic. And it came down to materials. There was a very high carbon content in the rivets, which caused them to be very brittle. So when they hit the iceberg, instead of the metal bending and deforming the way it's supposed to, it cracked and broke, and hence we had a very catastrophic accident there. So thinking about these words, get those good ingredients in, and we're going to have that good output. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at procurements today. And really, it's about getting those good ingredients. So let's just get a little context going first. I'm just going to pop open our first poll and asking a simple question: do your projects involve procurements? So I'll just give you a few moments there. Just click yes or no. I want to find out if your projects involve. Give it a couple more moments. All right, they're flowing in. The responses are flowing in fast and furious. We give it another 5 or 10 seconds. Click yes or no. Do your projects involve procurements? All right. Not quite the full population, but I'm going to respect the constraint that we have, which is to get done by 1 o'clock. So I'm going to close the poll here, broadcast the results. 76% of us are dealing with procurements in our projects. Not at all surprising results. A lot of projects are dealing with procurements. 76 versus 24%. And the reality is, vast majority of projects have procurements involved. Now, the procurements may be large, may be small, may be very formal. So we're going to move into our next poll, which we want to get a little bit of an idea of what is the size and nature of your procurement. So If you answered no in the first round, then we've got an option there. Don't do procurements. If they're small, it's about getting the job done. Maybe small and informal. Maybe small and formal. So you've got a very defined process. We've got large and informal. That sometimes occurs. And we've also got large and formal. So I want you to just take a few moments to just kind of check off the appropriate box, and let's see what types of procurements are happening out there. Okay, we'll give it a few more moments. If you could just pop in and click on which one of the 5 options there is appropriate to you: small informal, small formal, large informal, or large informal or large formal. Give it a few more moments. Will is saying all of the above. So Will, if you could pop in and vote on the most common. And absolutely, and Will, you raised a really good point there as we're just letting a few more people cast their votes here. It really does depend on the project, absolutely. Yeah, and we're going to kind of go into that. There is no vote button, Dave, so just click the radio button. You'll see your choice there. And all right, so let's end this poll here. I'm going to broadcast the results. Not surprising, we're seeing 48%, 49% really at large and formal. So when we get into procurements, we're often into that large formal phase. Now we see there's that 20% of not doing procurements. You know, fairly substantial number, 20%, but the reality is, you know, some projects have procurement, some don't. And that procurement may be in the form of resources, it may be in the form of equipment, materials, you know, whatever that looks like. Interesting in this results here, though, very low percentages on the informal, both on the small and the large, 7 and 4. So really looking at about 12% there, with rounding out with about 20%, 19.5, almost 20% on the small formal side. So you know, when we look at it versus formal versus informal, definitely a much higher percentage on the formal side. And this is really the main reason that we think about procurements and why we want to kind of call that expert. So let's just kind of put this all into a context here. In its simplest forms, procurement, you're buying stuff. I mean, really, that's the reality of what a procurement is. I mean, it's a big fancy word. There's lots of, you know, stuff around that. But at the end of the day, it's all about buying stuff. And when we need to buy things for our projects, you know, there's usually a contract involved. We look at the results of those polls, and those who are doing procurements, the majority are doing formal, which means you're writing a formal contract in some form. And my advice to you is contact your procurement departments. The reality is, and PMI recognizes this from a PMP perspective, they're not expecting us as PMs to write the contract, to negotiate the terms. They're really more expecting us to conduct the procurement. So we bring our procurement department into the fold, we bring them into the conversation. They're going to help us with the negotiation, with writing a legally binding contract, one that's actually acceptable. And I mean, I know in my experience, I've taken some contracts to lawyers, and they've looked in and says, this is actually not even legally binding. They can't hold you to this. We you know, as soon as you move from one jurisdiction to another, and whether that's municipal, provincial, federal, you know, if we start to get into international, you know, navigating that whole legal aspect of the procurement is tricky, and you really want to make sure that you're getting it done right. So just at a very high level, a contract is legally enforceable, and again, very high level, when you have an offer and an acceptance. So I offer you some goods or services, and you accept the offer. There is a consideration. It's usually in the form of money, right? But I may accept, you know, 3 chickens and a duck from you to pay for those services. But one of the keys, and this was one that surprised me a little bit, is you need to be legally recognizable separate parties. So I cannot enter into a contract with a department within my company. Right? So I can enter into a contract with another company, but I can't enter into a department. Now, I can enter into an agreement with another department, right? So it's not a legal contract. And it's kind of one of those subtleties of legal, and this is why we get the experts in the room. So why do we do this? Well, procurements carry risk, and we need to manage that risk. And I mean, managing risk, in my humble opinion, is one of the biggest success factors around project management in general. And procurements carry risk, right? We've got an exchange of money, of resources. We may or may not get the deliveries on time, all that kind of fun stuff. So our contracts are really about managing that risk, aka how to protect ourselves. So I'm going to follow some of my own advice, and I'm going to call in my expert. Hey, Natasha, where the heck are you? There she is. Hey, good morning, Natasha.
Hello,
so glad you can join
everybody.
us. I'm just going to unmute you here because you're currently muted. Oh, love software. There we are. Can we hear you? I think we can hear you now.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Natasha. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Natasha here. Natasha, you have got a lot of certifications, my dear.
Been busy.
You have. So Natasha's a certified life coach. More importantly, though, for our purposes, she's a certified Scrum Master and a project management professional, which is awesome. But also a certified black belt in Six Sigma, which when we talk about contracts and getting into those details and legal stuff, very important to have that kind of that depth. And I actually met Natasha through the Master's Certificate program, so I'm a graduate of that program, and so is Natasha, which is a fantastic program. So I'm going to put that out there. And most importantly, the reason I phoned Natasha is because, you know what, she's got a lot of really great experience, and she's been kind enough to say, I'm going to come and share this with you. But I have to put the legal disclaimer up. She is not a legal expert. So we're going to take a look at this more from the PM's perspective, because the procurement department is really very situational. It's very, what does your company look at? How does your company operate? So for me to do a session around that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But let's take a look at it from the PM's perspective. So we've got someone with some fantastic experience here. So Natasha, I'm going to pose these two kind of, I want to call them questions, but they're kind of themes to you. Okay. The first is around company norms and guidelines. And I want to kind of think about, what's from your experience on the procurement department formality versus the kind of get her done attitude. What are some of the pros and cons in your experience from there? And then we'll progress on and take a look at project procurement versus the operational side. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
I think those are two very excellent points to stress. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, I just want to stress that with procurement knowledge area activities, we are dealing with very situational type activities, and it's a particular knowledge area that's dependent a lot on the integration area. So to begin with, within the project charter, there may or may not be agreements. And these agreements may actually be global agreements that will impact your project, but they were negotiated and they have been entered into internationally, and you are just more executing essentially what the powers that be have already signed up for. Specific to company norms and guidelines, I'd say as a project manager, it is extremely important that you understand within the confines of your particular company what the norms and guidelines are. There are so many different iterations as far as by industry, whether it's public versus private, if it's a multinational. If we have a situation where you're procuring goods from another company, there may be tax and legal implications, and you really do need to reach out to your procurement department to get a better understanding of what is occurring.
So what I'm hearing here, Natasha, is that there's a larger environment that we need to be not only working within, but cognizant of, so that we're not breaking some rules, as it were, whether those are actually legal rules of the environment versus what's already been negotiated.
And where I would start is understanding exactly what your procurement norms or guidelines are. These guidelines will dictate what your parameters are, and it will also tell you what you can and cannot do.
Okay, interesting. Now, I put on here the quote from Peter Drucker, because I'm a huge fan of this quote. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And really, when we talk in terms of company norms and guidelines, that to me is really the guidelines of how we get the work done. So just want to, what are your thoughts?
From a project perspective, our focus is, of course, trying to get the resources in, get the work scheduled, get it executed properly, and so there tends to be a natural tension between the project team and the procurement department. But understanding the outliers, so the company norms, guidelines, the culture, that will dictate what you can and cannot do and help you navigate executing, conducting the procurements, controlling the procurements, and eventually closing those procurements out. There essentially will be the roadmap through which you'll be able to navigate the procurement aspects of the project.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's move on to our second main point here. And just before we do, what we're going to do is ask the simple question, does your organization follow its own procedures? Because we were just talking about the whole culture aspect of it and how, there's that culture piece. And pop into the poll while we introduce this. And poll should be open. Oh, look at that, they're already voting. Lovely. So, and Natasha brings up some really fantastic points here because we need to be very cognizant of what's going on in that larger picture, right? And being aware not only what are the particular pieces that we need to have in place, but what agreements and things are already in place. Okay, so we'll just give a couple more moments on the poll. All right. So just give a few more moments. We've got good representation of the population, just about half. Let's give it a few more moments. All right, let's broadcast the results. And I was really wondering when I put this question out there because I thought, depending upon your personality type. Now, I'm self-admittedly, I am the rule breaker. I am the I look for the way to get her done, and this is why I called Natasha in today, because I am not the one to be giving out procurement advice. So I was really wondering how much people are going to be saying yes and no on this. And I'm pleasantly surprised that it's 88%, almost 89% are saying yes, we follow our own procedures. And that's actually very heartening because I do recognize and appreciate that we need to follow those procedures. They're there for a good reason. And there's 11% there that are saying, yeah, not so much. And what level that looks at, and of course we could, if we had time to, do a little bit more investigation research and dig down into that and ask those questions, is it small companies, large companies, etc. I do find in that entrepreneurial spirit, we often get into we have a procedure, but we need to get the job done. So let's get the job done and not worry as much about the procedures. And I know a big part of that is also my own personal personality type. But it is encouraging to see that there's a large number of people out there that are actually following their procedures, which is a good thing. Now we also do have to balance that with getting the job done because red tape is red tape, and I know we often get sort of stuck in it. I'm a huge fan of the adage of rules are not meant to be broken, rules are meant to be followed. If the rule's broken, then we need to fix the rule, not break the rule. So let's move on to our second piece of our discussion today. Again, looking at the culture, company norms and guidelines, want to think about industry size, the whole private-public thing, and what are some of the issues that we run into there when we look at different procurements from different industries versus different sizes.
Thank you, David. That's actually a really good segue. I'm not actually that surprised by the poll results because what we find is when you're executing procurements in a project, part of the lessons learned gives the companies opportunities to sort of refine their existing corporate norms and guidelines to allow for project-specific procurements. But going back to the whole idea of overall company norms and guidelines, there are many different inputs that will drive what the end result norms and guidelines would look like. So as an example, public versus private. Public entities have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and the public overall. So they will typically have a lot more rigorous procurement norms in place. They tend to have longer guidelines because they'll have to go through things like tendering documents and things like that. And so you'll find in that scenario, it'll be very structured, and the lead times will tend to be a lot longer. And those things will, of course, come through in the way the company norms and guidelines are written. Another example is based on the overall company size. So as an example, the bigger the company, the more obligations that they may be on the hook for. So you'll have a procurement department that would be more involved in the project procurements, just because from an obligations perspective, instead of thinking of tens of thousands, we may be thinking millions, hundreds of millions, and in some cases, billions. Another example is the construction industry, where you'll have very rigorous tendering documentation, bidding. And so based on that, the company norms is going to dictate all of these different things, and that will be the output. And that, of course, the project manager should be well aware when they're navigating the project procurements. The pros and cons associated with that is, as certain regulations change, you have to be abreast with what's happening. The pros associated with that is, if there is an existing procurement department, you actually have internal support that will help you navigate the project procurements.
So basically what I'm hearing then is kind of use your environment and leverage those facilities that are available to you.
Absolutely.
It's interesting when you said about publicly traded companies. What are your thoughts around public sector versus kind of private sector? So the government procurements and the.
So specific to public firms or public offerings, the procurement, it almost falls into the same category as construction, where it is heavily regulated. And so if you had a small private firm, they may go with just a very simple bidding process where they've sent out a statement of work, and 2 or 3 or 4 vendors may bid. Whereas in the case of a public entity, they may have a template. It may actually have to go through their legal department. It may have to go through 1 or 2 iterations in their legal department, and then it would go to a public tendering. So it would go to a more formalized RFQ or RFP process. And so again, just by virtue of the steps, the lead times with regards to procuring certain resources, you're now going from what could be a month for a smaller firm to as long as 6 months in a year in order to sort of navigate the procurement process or activities.
Excellent. Thank you for those wonderful insights. I can honestly say we are experiencing that right now. One of our clients, who's a very large multinational, they're actually based over in Spain, and we're dealing with their North American presence. Their procurement processes, I don't want to use the word painful, but let's just say it's vigorous and very, very thorough. And we can respect that because they are a huge multinational. They are on the top end of their business. They are dealing in billions. Granted, our procurement with them, or our contract with them, is in the high thousands. Not quite million yet. We're hoping, but it's one of those things where it's we do have to respect that, and we have those processes, and sometimes the processes are put in place to deal with some very large numbers and hence very large risks. And here we're doing our small project, and I know a lot of organizations will attempt to deal with that by tiering their projects. But with that kind of in mind, thinking around the whole procurement department and looking at procurement within a project role versus an operational role, because while we may be running a project to do something relatively small, we're dealing with the procurement department, which is really designed to deal with kind of all of this stuff. So, what is some of your experience around?
So I think it's a really good question. I'd like to go back for a bit to the company norms. That is essentially your roadmap for how you're going to navigate your project procurement. Based on what the guidelines are, you'll essentially have a checklist of all of the steps that you have to go through in order to conduct a procurement. So based on that and the size of your company, that's going to determine whether the procurement team will have 100% responsibility, or if in the unusual scenario where there really isn't a procurement team, where the project manager will actually be taking on a lot more of the procurement. Under each scenario, having a really clear project management plan that's going to determine the resources, give you some insight into whether or not you have enough information to detail whether it's a time and material contract or whether it's going to be a fixed price contract where we're just going to determine certain milestones in certain months. So it's very key to understand exactly what your scope is and what your inputs are that are going to drive your project deliverables. Because based on that, you will be able to understand what contract types you should be entering into, or at a bare minimum, present what you need to a procurement department, and they will be able to provide you with their best determination.
Oh, fantastic. So really kind of leveraging that infrastructure that's already there while still trying to stay responsive to our project needs and finding that appropriate contract. And you did touch on a couple of the different types of contracts. And I know a lot of people struggle with the wording within PMBOK. And if you wouldn't mind just taking a couple minutes here to kind of walk us through, what is a fixed price contract versus cost reimbursable? Because I mean, everyone uses that terminology of time and materials, but there's cost reimbursable plus.
Sure. So a time and material is probably the simplest. So that's where for every resource, from a contract perspective, you'd have labor hours, and then you would also have a material cost. In some cases, the material may have a markup on it, or what's called a flow-through. So it would be the cost of the material plus 0%. And so on a monthly, weekly, annual basis, you would receive a contract for work that's been performed or products that have been received. So that's probably the simplest to track as well. Another scenario is a fixed price contract where they've taken the scope and they've broken it down into increments or milestones, and the vendor has gone back and they've determined a certain value on a monthly basis or on a forecasted monthly basis that breaks out. In the case of a software contract, it may be a build. They may say build may be 1.0, and in a $5 million contract, they may determine that the build portion is $1 million. And then underneath that, they would break up the $1 million into different stages as far as test, design, and things like that. So that's more of a flat contract. It's not tied to, in a given month, they may have 0 labor costs, but certain milestones may be achieved. So that's where the fixed price comes into play. And cost reimbursable is where certain costs are paid for by the vendor, and then they were reimbursed after the fact.
Right. So you're effectively, I'm as your vendor, I'm buying those materials ahead of time. Love it. I'm buying those up for you, and then hence trading them back. Okay, wonderful. Now we have a question. sorry, let me just look this up here. From Will Simons, and he asked, any suggestions on approaches to mitigating the time factor? Because as you've already alluded to, we have a very, oftentimes a very, not onerous process, but a very thorough process that we need to go through, and those processes, of course, take time. And again, we've got a client right now that we're dead in the middle of doing that, and it is, you know, we've negotiated the contract from a discussion perspective. We've settled on a price and everything, and we're now just like literally spending a couple months getting it all entered and approved.
So I think there's a couple of suggestions. Going back to something that I said originally, the procurement knowledge area is a very tenuous one, because it's really the execution activity that's related to a series of decisions or strategies that have been put in place, in some cases prior to the project or the program beginning. So it's really important that when you begin with the project charter, that if there is an existing agreement, or if there are preferred vendors, that especially if they're vendors that have a long horizon. So I believe this question is probably going back to where you're dealing with a public entity, where we may be going into longer lead times around RFQs, RFP, huge heavy tendering processes. I think that is something that will need to be identified up front and in the initiating stages, so that when the scheduling occurs, the expectations around when they would come to some conducting the procurement and the contract is actually signed, that if it is in fact 16 weeks, that we actually give 16, in some cases 18 weeks, so that the project scheduling is realizable. But again, it is very tenuous, because in a lot of cases, you are on the hook as far as an existing agreement, or you are bound just from a preferred vendor perspective to go with a vendor where there is a lead time. That needs to be highlighted, and it needs to be realistically planned for. And in some cases, a contingency plan in place, just so that you don't interfere with the project scheduling and it moves from being a procurement into a risk.
Nice, thank you so much. We do have a comment from Juan, you know, saying it depends on what you're procuring and current market conditions, and asked for a little bit of expansion on that. He was saying, you know, how
yeah, I think that's a really good point. I do agree that current market conditions can definitely impact procurement. It can impact it as far as price. It can impact as far as quality of product, the quality of returns. There's so many considerations behind the market conditions. We can go in from a budget perspective and budget that a particular resource may be $100 an hour, and then for some reason that resource seems to be particularly hot, and all of a sudden it pushes the price up, and now we're looking at $120 an hour, just basically as a result of market conditions. So it's something that we have to be mindful of, and that's something that should be actually layered into the risk plan associated with the procurement.
Fantastic, thank you. There's an additional comment there from Juan around, you know, before the 2008 financial crisis, suppliers in Europe really had lots of stock available, and it kind of really highlights that whole side of things when, you know, when the markets are good and there's lots of economic prosperity, there's availabilities there that might not be available when the market is not as good. I do know from my own work in working in the financial sector years ago, when things were up, it becomes, you know, we're running all kinds of projects, and then, you know, things start to get tight because of a market downturn, and all of a sudden, you know, the brakes go on, and as you know, Juan's commenting there, time becomes a factor. It's also a very important constraint. So we end up kind of, you know, going between the whole, is money my number one, is you know, time my number one, And of course, as we can appreciate, that's going to have a huge impact on our procurements and what we procure, what we don't procure, and sometimes even which projects we tackle and don't. So I'm going to turn this back to the team out there. We've got almost 80 people on the line today, which is fantastic. And what I'm going to do is simply pose this question to you. What advice do you have for conducting procurements? We've been kind of giving you some of our advice, and don't worry, the siren's not for us. And want to see what your advice is. All right, we're getting some great comments in. Harry says, sooner the better. Harry, could you expand on that a little bit? I think I have an idea what you're talking about here, but I just want to make sure. From Steve, be involved. Totally agree. This is not a sit back and wait and let them do it. And yeah, and really, being involved. I think that highlights the difference between a project procurement and an operational procurement. Establish realistic timelines in advance on current environment. I love that you put environment in quotes there. The term we'll be working in. From Tom, use the procurement department to make things flow smoothly. Absolutely. You know what? We need to bring the experts into the room that we need, right? I'm a huge fan of get the right people on the bus. Be prepared for a long journey in some cases, from Doug, absolutely. And nice qualification there, Doug, in some cases. Sometimes we can fast track it, sometimes we can't, right? From Wendy, timelines. Layering on that, be prepared to take a long time. To be done based on the schedule, that can be tough. Sometimes the schedule drives it. If we have key milestones we have to hit, now we've got to ask ourselves the question, is this the exception to the rule? Can we pull some things out to be able to get it done? From Gerald, excuse me. Read the contract with a big old exclamation mark there, my friend. Oh, yes, so true. How many of us, and you don't have to actually raise your hands here, but guilty as charged, how many of us have scanned through that contract on those online things and just said, yep, I agree, without reading it? And of course, when you try to read it, it's like, is it English or is it, Greek? Ensure all stakeholders are on board from Sator. Yes, absolutely, Sator. Yeah, engage your procurement department in the onset there. On time, on budget from Julie. Absolutely. I mean, this is why we do the contracts ahead of time, so that we get the timelines nailed down, we get the budgets named down. To fit to the project specific situation, so it's definitely very situational. Familiarize yourself with the procurement process of your org very well, all caps there, Alex. Yeah, you really want to know what the ins and outs are, and we're struggling with that right now because we've got some new players on the other side with that client of ours, and we're figuring it out. Ensure the client policies are understood, they're followed, clearly define what is needed and when it is needed, so that we can make sure that the process is supporting us as opposed to we're fighting it. So lovely comment, Chantal. Thank you so much. Start early, leverage the experts, both legal and procurement. Put you in a better negotiation position. From L. Bowen, absolutely. Engage the procurement department in your project planning at the onset. If we know we're going to be doing it, the sooner the better. Absolutely. So some really good advice here. And I say really good advice because you're agreeing with us, so it must be good advice that I'm guessing is where we're at. All right. Now, with these webinars, we're always looking at the PMBOK side of things. We've had some great advice from our guests today around how to do this. I want to put this into a context now of the PMBOK and where it sits. So we look at the procurement management processes. We've got 4 of them: plan, conduct, control, and close. The plan and close is the ones we're seeing in all the knowledge areas. And it makes sense. It kind of frames it. It's the close is kind of a bit of an odd one out here because procurements are like their own little mini projects. So we have them happening within the larger project context. But the ones I want to focus in on today is plan and control. And in particular, I'm actually going to drill down to a couple of the tools and techniques here, which is procurement negotiations, which is under conduct procurements, and claims administration, which is under control procurements. So both of these really are around negotiation. So, we have a very limited time together, an hour, and honestly, procurement's a huge topic. There's a lot of details in there, but I wanted to, what's the key message I want you to take out of this? Well, number one, and I think it's really well received, engage the experts here. Bring in your legal department, bring in your procurement department. Now, procurement negotiations, again, purpose, it's about getting stuff. Like really, folks, let's boil it down to simple terms here, right? We're here to buy something, right? We're here to get stuff, whether that's raw material that we're going to then leverage within our project, whether that's, resources to be able to do the project, whatever that looks like. Basic principle, though, and this is encompassed and embodied in all of the processes. Basic principle is that it needs to be ethical. So when we look at the different contract types, we want to be asking ourselves, what's an appropriate contract type for this negotiation, for this contract? It needs to be legal, right? We don't want to break the law. It's not good business, but it also needs to be sustainable. So we want to look for how can we do this on that kind of longer term. So when we think about procurement negotiations, it involves clarification and it involves mutual agreement. We need to have agreement on both sides. So we may be negotiating around quality, scope, cost, time, resources, etc. They're going to be embodied in the contract. Now, when I first started studying negotiations, one of the key tenets that I really like around that is negotiations all about reaching agreement. So you need to have both parties at the table working collaboratively to reach an agreement. Now, if you're not both there to reach an agreement, you're not in a negotiation. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was, first of all, ask yourself, are you in a negotiation or not? And if you're not, you need to either step away or change your tactics. And reaching agreement is about the successful negotiation or the successful contract. And its outcome is based on both parties getting what they need. Now, notice I didn't say both parties getting what they want. No, it's about what we need, because if I get what I need, the contract is lasting. And really that is the main indicator of a successful contract, is that the contract lasts. I'm sure many of you have had this experience where you've entered into a contract. It's one that didn't last. It's one that you couldn't live with. So when we get into the lasting contract, that's a good sign that people have gotten what they need. And within that, we want to work collaboratively. So, when we look at that whole collaborative skill set piece, it's around not imposing a solution. So when I come to the table and I say, I've got the solution, I'm not working collaboratively, I'm pushing that solution onto you, right? So if I'm going to truly work with collaboratively, it's not about the solution, it's about the need. So I'm going to come to the table and say, here's what my needs are. Let's figure out what your needs are, and then let's together collaboratively work together to figure out what the solution is. It's about providing that background information. When I teach the negotiation skills, and I'm a huge proponent of integrative negotiation as a style, huge proponent of, lay the cards on the table, share your needs with the other party. If you can't do that with the other party, you're not in a negotiation, you're into a positional bargaining. But if you can't do that, then there's a problem with the relationship, and fix the problem with the relationship with the other party first, and your negotiations will go much, much better. Don't surrender your needs to reduce tension. Invite the different views. So it's going to be difficult. I'm not saying this is easy, folks, right? But we don't surrender our needs to reduce tension. We invite those in different views, and we look at, we retain our needs, and we search deeply for understanding. And there's a great Stephen Covey quote around this, which is, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And we tend to walk in around this world in general saying, me, and here's my position, here's my stuff, right? So, we need to take a look at that. Now, anytime we're in a negotiation, there is conflict. So we're going to be somewhere on this conflict scale, right? And the goal here is to try to move down from the high conflict side of things to the lower conflict side of things. So if over on the left where we have mediation, that's high conflict. If I'm in a negotiation and the conflict is getting high, it's getting worse, we get into things like mediation, we get into things like arbitration, we get into things like litigation if it gets really bad. And in mediation, this is a scenario where, you know what, I'm having so much conflict with you right now, I can't even talk to you. I need to have someone stand between us and actually mediate and enable us to have a conversation, let alone actually come to an agreement. Arbitration is the next level up from that. It's basically now someone else is making the decision for us. So we think about, when a union goes on strike, or a sports team goes on strike because their contract's finished, and they get into and negotiations break down, right? We get into mediation, we get into arbitration, and then it just becomes a question of, is it binding arbitration or not? So when we're in that negotiation, the more we can reduce the conflict, the more we're moving towards problem solving. And the best way to do this is to figure out what's in common, because the more we have in common, the more we're able to move towards problem solving. Now, I want to just use a little bit of popular culture here to kind of really illustrate what problem solving is versus negotiation, because we often sort of interchange those two, and they're extremely different. Think about the movie Apollo 13. And I know it's an older movie, but it's a good one. It's one of my favorites. In the movie Apollo 13, here we had the real life scenario where you had 3 people up in space and they were running out of oxygen. So they now had to figure out how to take this round oxygen scrubber filter and fit it into the square oxygen scrubber that was in the limb. So they're trying to figure this out. Now, there was no conflict. There was a problem. But the whole team was all coming around the table saying, yes, we agree there's a problem. Yes, we agree we have to solve it. Yes, we agree on the parameters of that solution. Yes, we agree on the parameters of the constraints of what we had. There was no conflict. So they were solidly in problem-solving mode, right? Now, they weren't arguing around who owns the problem. They weren't arguing around, well, it's not my fault. It's not my problem to solve and things like that. Then we'd be into conflict. But now we're into if we can move into that problem solving. Now, there's a great question here. What if the other party does not intend on any negotiation at all? And I love Juan's response to that. You'll have to search for another source. 100%. You are not in a negotiation. Now, you can only control yourself, right? You cannot force the other party to move into negotiation. And if that other party does not want to come to the table and work with you, you're not in a negotiation. I'm just going to back up a couple slides here for a second. Remember, to be in a negotiation, you've got 2 parties that are working together to reach an agreement. Now, there can still be some conflict involved. We can still be in a little bit of conflict here. But the other party needs to be working with you at some level to get to that agreement. And the more I can move that conflict down the scale towards problem solving, the more I can reduce that conflict, the easier the negotiation is going to go. Right? So we can still, work collaboratively. And, I love the analogy of don't sit across the table as opposing forces, but let's get up and walk shoulder to shoulder, heading towards the same goal together as a team, working towards that same problem, right? Working towards that solution. So that's the establishing the contract. That's the, negotiating the contract. We've now got it established. We're running it. We're partway through our project. We've procured half or 3/4 or a third or whatever of whatever it is we've negotiated and contracted with you. What happens halfway through when things aren't going that well? Well, we get into claims administration. And if you've done your homework, if you've done your job well, you have a predefined claims administration methodology, sequence, process built into the contract. And when we deal with that, the purpose here is to deal with the issues. The basic principle is work it out between yourselves. Look for the win-win. Now, again, we go back to that conflict scale. The more we can reduce the conflict, the more we can move into problem solving, the more we can work with our teams, our partners collaboratively as in more of a team environment. So when we talk about claims administration, and you look at the details behind that, right in PMBOK it says negotiation is the preferred method. Now, when we get into claims administration, it's very easy for us to say, well, here's what's written in the contract. I'm going to, apply that. That may be appropriate. That absolutely may be appropriate, and you've put that in to protect yourselves. But this is the phoning the police on your neighbor scenario. This is the let's try to avoid having having to call out the official process. If we can sit down and work through that with our partners, and of course we're going to do that legally, we're going to do that openly, we're going to do that honestly as much as possible. And we may have to re-engage. We may have to re-engage the procurement department. But let's figure this out. Let's work as a team, right? There's a couple of comments that just popped in. I just want to, yeah, okay. So I think we covered those. So we do get into dispute resolution, absolutely. Now, in a larger project, in a larger contract, there's going to be a dispute review board. And we often use dispute review boards so that we don't get into single person opinions. We can look at things from multiple angles, etc. But when we get into dispute resolution, hopefully your contract is well created, that it does have a dispute review board or have some mechanism around that. We can move into mediation if we have to. We can move into arbitration, if things kind of escalate. So just as we're wrapping up here, my number one point for you guys is engage the experts. And with that in mind, I'm going to re-engage my expert.
I'm back. So going back to the idea of conducting procurements, I read a lot of really good feedback. My best advice for conducting procurements is to conduct procurements through the lens of how am I going to monitor and control it and eventually close it satisfactorily from as far as the project deliverables. And so as we're going through and we're negotiating with vendors, setting up contracts, making sure that contracts actually have remediation penalty clauses if necessary. There's a beautiful quote out there where you aim for the sky, but you plan for the ground. And so from a contract perspective, you want to make sure that you've covered all of your bases so that should something come to into a bit of a gray area and there's some arbitration that needs to be done, that there is a clear path that's been outlined contractually as far as the next steps.
Fantastic. Thank you for that input. So just as we close out, again, engage your experts, and I thank Natasha again for taking the time today to be with us and appreciate her time. It's a pleasure. We want to scale appropriately. So we've been talking a lot about, what that looks like, large procurements, small procurements, scale to what makes sense. We also have that whole time thing coming in. Sometimes the operational procurement process may not be appropriate for your projects. And you need to negotiate that, you need to talk about that, so there may be some negotiation even within the organization as well as externally. Again, work collaboratively, and that collaboratively extends not only to your partners, but also within your organization. So you're engaging your experts, you're working collaboratively with your procurement department, so put aside the whole rebel without a cause, behaviors and say, we're going to work in concert with those environments. And then, of course, work in concert with your vendors, with your suppliers, or if you are the supplier, with your clients, so that you're adjusting your processes to help match theirs and finding that middle ground that works. Remember, projects are different than operations. And number one here, folks, reduce that conflict. And that conflict can be both internally, externally, etc. So just to kind of bring this full circle back to our friend Mario, spend as for the best available. Now, notice I didn't say spend a lot, right? We still want to get value for our money, right? But buy good stuff, because when you have good, delicious ingredients, you end up with, or at least you have the better option, or possibility of good, delicious, results. And putting this together today and thinking about my friend Natasha, and she's a big foodie. So am I. So I thought, what, we got to do a food theme here. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to leave it open for a few moments. If you have any questions for either myself or Natasha, just pop into the chat box there, type those in. Thank you again for your time today. Our 10th and final in this series is going to be coming up in about a month. It's not quite the beginning of the month, unfortunately, vacations and things. But we will be covering off stakeholders, a very key knowledge area of our last one. And tell you what, we could just spend days on that one. But we'll find some good nuggets for you, and hopefully you'll be back, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Just checking the comments here. Thank you for the appreciation, and thanks for the nice comments there. We'll appreciate that. Beautiful, great. So thank you again, Natasha. We'll see you all next time. As always, you can contact me, david.donaldson@tidalshift.ca, if you have any questions that you think of later. We'll see you guys next time. We will be following up with an email with the link for the recording.